it's not so much of what you know, so much as being that listening ear. And sometimes people aren't really looking for you to answer a specific question. They just want to have a sounding board for the things that they're doing and hear what they're doing right and what they can improve on and things like that. But, you do have to be prepared for just about anything.
Welcome to another episode of the Beef Podcast Show. My name is Dr. Stephanie Hansen. I'm a feedlot nutritionist at Iowa State University and one of your co-hosts for the show. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest and a returning colleague of mine, Dr. Katherine VanValin, who is an assistant extension professor at the University of Kentucky. So she has a bachelor in ag and chemistry from Western Kentucky University, a master's of science from Virginia Tech, and a PhD from in ruminant nutrition. Actually, she was my graduate student back in the day, so from Iowa State. So we're really excited to have Katie with us here today. So welcome to the show, Katie.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I was trying to remember, I didn't go to the National Animal Science meetings when they were down in Kentucky a few years ago. So I'm not sure we've actually, so we're on YouTube here, right? Or whatever. I'm not sure we've seen each other face to face since you left.
Yeah, I don't think we have.
Yeah.
It's definitely been a while.
It definitely has. Although I've seen lots of pictures of your adventures and things going on in your family and everything like that. So you've been a busy gal down there in Kentucky.
We have been, yeah. Welcomed my son just about a year ago. So that certainly changed things on the home front for me, but still doing a lot on, at work and getting our program set up here as well.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we're going to want to talk about today is the fact that you really got the opportunity to eventually basically go back home. And that's not something that we all get lucky enough to do, but kind of, I think the stars aligned for the perfect position opening up for you. So let's make sure we talk about that eventually. But first, why don't you start by telling our listeners a little bit about your history and how you got into the beef industry?
Yes, so I'm originally from Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is a town about an hour north of Nashville, Tennessee, and was born there. My dad's family was born and raised there, and my grandpa ran a commercial cow-calf operation in Warren County for many, many years, and that was really my first introduction to the beef industry was my grandpa's cow herd. And I always tell people he was a very typical Kentucky cattle producer, commercial cow-calf, about 30 cows. He fit all those typical demographics. And so that's really what got me interested. And then when I went to undergrad, I actually grew up in Michigan, and so came back to Kentucky to do my undergrad at Western Kentucky with the thought that I would go to vet school, like so many of us animal scientists start out with. And so thought I wanted to go to vet school, and actually my intro to animal science class with my professor, Dr. Jones, started to introduce me to a lot of the other career paths in animal science, and started getting me interested in thinking about some of those other options. And ruminant nutrition was always so fascinating to me just because of the complexities of the rumen and the ability to capture the energy out of forages in a way that other monogastric species can't. Certainly was interesting to me. And so over time, I started kind of shifting away from wanting to go to vet school and wanting to pursue a graduate career path in ruminant nutrition.
Is stress affecting your bottom line? Even routine handling, inclement weather, weaning, and dietary changes can significantly lower the rumen pH, causing cortisol levels to spike. Cortisol not only compromises the immune system, but also suppresses normal appetite and feed consumption. The solution? Cattle Active. Increase production and reduce the impacts of stress on your cattle for cents a day. Cattle Active restores the balance naturally. Want to learn more how a feeding program including Cattle Active can improve both profits and herd health? Visit us today at proearthanimalhealth.com. Be proactive with Cattle Active.
Nice. And you have a pretty diversified background in terms of what your graduate education ended up being. So you went to Virginia Tech first. So tell us a little bit about who you worked with there and kind of some of the research that you worked on.
Yep. So when I went to Virginia Tech, I worked with Dr. Samer El-Kadi, who really focuses more in nutritional physiology and swine models for biomedical research. And so I went into his lab, which was a very basic research lab, doing a lot of work on glucose metabolism in neonatal piglets. And I was doing a fescue toxicosis project in a cow-calf model. So very applied and very different from what my colleagues there were working on. And so that was a really unique experience. It also, I was working with the 4-H judging programs and 4-H youth extension as part of my assistantship there, which is, I think, really what got me interested in extension and exposed me to extension through that training. And, all along, I have always had an interest in micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. They've always fascinated me. It's such a small portion of the diet, but when they're either not there or they're there in too big of a quantity, we can really throw things off. And so that always fascinated me. And so when I went to go do my PhD work, luck would have it that I ended up at Iowa State and working with you and got to do a lot of really great mineral research. And that really did kind of set me up nicely to come back to Kentucky. That's an area that we struggle in. We have a lot of selenium and copper deficiency in the state. And so when I got the opportunity to come back as an extension faculty member, having that background in mineral nutrition really has helped me start some programs related to that.
I think it's kind of interesting because it sounds like you pushed your master's professor kind of in a slightly different direction. And then I feel like you kind of did the same with me. I was actually thinking about it this morning before we started recording. I distinctly remember sitting in my living room and having a notebook in my lap and having a conversation with you well before you even came to Iowa State. I think maybe you'd been here for a visit, but you weren't here physically yet, right, for starting for your PhD. And we were designing this lamb stress project.
Yep.
And I was like, Lordy, I don't work with lambs very often. And I sure don't know enough about ACTH and all these things that you wanted to do. But I was excited to see how we were going to work with zinc and that, right? And that's what we did. And so it's interesting to see how you, maybe you've always pushed your advisors to kind of go in a tangential direction.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, and now in my professional career, people will sometimes see my name associated with sheep, and I have to remind them that I'm not a sheep nutritionist. That gets a little outside of my normal realm, but yeah, the work with sheep that we did at Iowa State it challenged me as a student. It was a much more intensive project than what I had been exposed to, and I'm so thankful that I had that kind of diversity of experiences, because it certainly helps you be more well-rounded when you get out in the real world and the training wheels are off and you're responsible for creating those projects and running those projects as a faculty member.
I think extension, I always have such high regard for folks who have roles in extension because you really have to be a Jack or a Jill of all trades, right? You really have to be able to pivot from the genetics question to the nutrition question. And it depends what the critical mass is at your particular institution. Do you have a lot of people that you could punt different questions to for expertise? That's not always, a luxury that every state has. So before we kind of start talking about like some of the things with your program and some of the history there, do you have any interesting stories related to, times when you've got an extension question that you were just like, that is the most off the wall thing that I've ever heard?
Yeah, I remember one of my very first questions, if I could even call it that. A producer called and said he had a question, and 30 minutes later, I pretty much heard the entire history of his operation, but there was no question. And I've learned that sometimes in this role, it's not so much of what you know, so much as being that listening ear. And sometimes people aren't really looking for you to answer a specific question. They just want to have a sounding board for the things that they're doing and hear what they're doing right and what they can improve on and things like that. But, you do have to be prepared for just about anything. And one thing that I've never been afraid to say I don't know. And I think that that's a very important thing to learn, especially when you first get out of grad school, man. When you've been donned as a PhD and people think you know everything about everything. And the reality is you know everything about a very little portion of ruminant nutrition, for example, or the beef industry. And there's a lot of things that you don't know and a lot of things that you don't get trained for in grad school. So learning to say I don't know, but I can find the answer, or I'll find somebody that does know, has been a really important part of starting to get successful in this extension path.
Yeah, I think that is fabulous advice, Katie. I couldn't second that greatly enough, because that is exactly where we see young people sometimes, either trying to fake it till they make it and they have a misstep with that, or they lack the true confidence that it takes to admit that you don't know something. And I think that's especially hard if it's something where you're like, "Ooh, I feel like I probably should know that," but being willing to say, I don't know, and having like that, I always call it kind of like phraseology. What's that thing that you can just be like, give me a day and let me do some digging into this. I think I have a recommendation in mind, but I really just want to confirm a few things before we talk about it, right? And I feel like that is a way to keep you from being like, here's a bunch of BS that might not be correct.
And people have so much more respect for you in the long run if you're able to say I don't know and get them the right information than to give them half the story that you do remember in that moment. They would much rather get a phone call back that says I'm confident in this answer. They have so much more respect for you. And just thinking about being able to say I don't know, I actually did that in my job interview for this position. One of my job responsibilities is overseeing the cow herd here, and they asked me if that was something I felt comfortable doing. And my grandpa ran the cow herd. I never ran a cow herd. I have all the training in the world from some of the best universities that would tell me that I should be able to do that, but I've never done it. And that was my response to that question was I don't know because I've never done it. And that actually was very well respected in my interview, to say that, and to say that I don't know, but we're going to find out, and that really helped me when I got started too, because it helps people manage expectations, and keeps you from getting in a situation that you're not prepared for.
Definitely. Okay, so our listeners might be thinking, man, Katie had it made in the shade. She got to go back home to Western Kentucky and, work there at the station and back in her home neighborhood. But you've had a few challenges in terms of resources and other things that have happened. So for context, you started your position at the University of Kentucky in January of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So we know nothing big happened in the year of 2020.
Yeah.
What was it like to have been 3 months into a brand new faculty position? You had a brief postdoc kind of in between your PhD and the faculty position, but pretty much straight off the buzz in terms of grad school. What was that like getting started in the time of lockdown?
Yeah, so I have an 80-20 extension research split, and the extension work never stopped. It changed. We weren't doing in-person meetings, but we started doing webinars right away, and podcasts and videos, and so we just changed how we did things. And to be honest, it kind of changed the game forever. It forced us all to start using technology and getting information in that way. And our producers kind of learned that they like to tune into a webinar sitting in their recliner at night versus getting dressed to go to the county extension office. So some of those things have stuck with us, past COVID. So the extension side was just a pivot. It looked different than I expected. I always tell people I spent way more time talking to my computer screen than I ever thought I would in extension. But the research side, that was really challenging because we had to put a stop to any non-emergent research. And when I've been on the job for about 6 weeks, I didn't even have my research up and going. So that certainly kind of delayed getting started on things. And of course, the seasonal nature. We have a cow herd here at the research station that we can utilize for research, but cow calf is very much a seasonal, production cycle. So if I missed calving or I missed the breeding season, I kind of have to wait a whole nother year to get that going. And so that's what we saw. And then coming out of COVID, as we kind of, the effects of COVID lingered on into 2021. But right as we were starting to see the light at the end of that tunnel and get things geared up in December of 2021, the Western Kentucky region was hit with a historical tornado outbreak. And so our research station here took a direct hit from a long-tracked EF4 tornado. So it was EF4 and about 3/4 of a mile wide when it hit our station. It was a Friday night, and I tell people it kind of went right through the heart of our station. It took out all of our equipment storage, most of our equipment, our main buildings, our labs, our offices were completely destroyed. We lost several homes that were on the station. And then it kind of took out about as much perimeter fence as it could. It took out almost 9 miles of perimeter fence. And so it did a lot of damage. Fortunately, we had several people here that night. That we didn't have any serious injuries there. And so that was a huge win out of that. Our cow herd, we did lose some animals, but considering the damage around them, it's relatively minimal impacts there. So, but it did take out our research capabilities. It took out several of our working facilities. I didn't have scales. It took out our feeding barn. So it kind of put another stop on doing research. And it also required us to pivot. I mean, we were out picking up debris out of the fields, and we were, getting fencing put back in. And we've done a lot of, as faculty, we've had to do a lot of work on designing what these new facilities are going to look like. And I mean, these are all things that I have zero background in. I am not a very handy person. And so trying to determine a design of a feeding barn, that is not something I had on my plate or had planned. But I've learned a lot in the process, and we'll have some good facilities when we get done with this, I hope. But we're still dealing with that. So I work out of a trailer. That's my office right now, and will be for probably another 18 months or so as we build back the main buildings. And so yeah, it's been a real challenge. And initially our colleagues on campus really understood that, but it's kind of been a challenge for people to wrap their heads around how disruptive it's been to the faculty here, and some faculty more than others. My program, for example, we have a lot of infrastructure that was impacted, and it's impacting me specifically. So it's definitely been a challenge, and put a delay on getting research programs started for sure.
So tell our listeners, you and I have talked a lot, and this is, hopefully a once in a lifetime experience, although maybe you've had some other things we can talk about too. Tell our listeners a little bit about the Princeton Station, because it's really kind of unique in the sense that you have not just animal science, but you have some other scientists there. That was one of the reasons you were really excited to go there, was, having things like some mineral analysis capabilities and stuff in some of your labs. So Tell us a little bit about the makeup of the station, kind of, the cow makeup, numbers, things like that, so we can kind of wrap our heads around kind of what this station looks like.
Yeah, so our station is about 1,300 acres, and on the livestock side, cattle is the only livestock that we have represented here. Western Kentucky actually has quite a bit of grain crop production. So we have a lot of plant and soil scientists that are based here. That's probably our biggest makeup of faculty. We have plant pathologists here, entomology, horticulture is represented here. So it's a really diverse group of faculty kind of from across our college that are all housed here. And, we actually our building was actually like brand new when I got there. So it had just been fully redone and a big expansion to it. And so we had like brand new lab facilities. And as a faculty member, I was really excited about that. And so, of course, those are no longer, but we'll have brand new ones again. So we can try it a second time, I guess. But yeah, we have 2 service labs here so that our extension agents can bring samples to. So we would have a soil testing lab and a plant disease diagnostic laboratory on site. And of course, those have kind of been impacted by the tornado as well. We've got some temporary lab facilities that allow us to do some things, but things like mineral analysis we can't do because the ICP equipment just doesn't work in a temporary trailer. So there's still some things like that we're working through that we won't be, have our full capabilities back up until we're in the new building. But yeah, it's such a diverse group of people here, and it's one of the things I like. Like, I don't come from a strong forage background, but I have a forage specialist across the hall that I can work with and answer questions and collaborate with. So that's really nice. In a lot of ways, you're more connected to colleagues across your college than just within your department, because we're housed all together and not with our home departments on campus. But as far as our cow herd, we have about 150 mama cows. They're all fall calving, and they are a Brangus and Angus cross herd. And so we use those for primarily some long-term selenium research that's been going on here for many years. So we actually have 2 groups of cows that have been maintained now for over 10 years on their respective selenium treatments. So half of those get all of their selenium from sodium selenite, or the inorganic source, and the other group gets a 50-50 blend of sodium selenite and selenium yeast, the organic form of selenium. And so they've been doing studies looking at impacts on fescue toxicosis, and we see that providing that improved selenium, we get better selenium status, less of a negative impact from fescue toxicosis, especially on things like reproduction and some of those hormonal changes that are occurring due to fescue toxicosis. We see some of that alleviated with the selenium treatments. And so that work is still ongoing. We were actually able to maintain those cow herds through the tornado. They were combined for like a week, and we just took the mineral supplement away for a week. And then once they were divided back out, they got back on those. So we now have a lot of cows in those groups that were conceived on those treatments and remain on those treatments for their entire life. So they're kind of a unique resource, and I'm glad that we were able to maintain that throughout the natural disasters that occurred here, because they are, like I said, they're very unique, and it's taken a lot of time to get them to where they are now.
Nice. And I'm trying to remember who the researcher at Kentucky is. It Jamie?
Jamie Matthews. Yep. So, Dr. Jamie Matthews, and then Dr. Phil Bridges is a repro physiologist on our faculty that started doing a lot of the initial work. And then when I came in and I had a mineral background, that was exciting for everybody to get a mineral person in this role. And so I've jumped in to try and start some of that as well. And of course, with all the challenges, it's been slow, but we're getting those things back up and going, and I'm excited for that. And also got some more applied mineral projects that we're working on and getting going, looking at things like mineral intake. Free choice mineral intake is a kind of a big black hole. We don't know a lot about it. We don't know a lot about that individual animal variation other than it exists, and we know it exists. So we've got some capabilities to measure that on pasture here. And so I'm excited to start getting into kind of the more applied side of mineral nutrition.
Nice. So you have what are they, like the smart feeders or something like that to be able to do mineral intake?
Yep. So we've got CLOC bunks that are the smart feed bunks that can go out on pasture and have those set up. And then we also have Kaylin gate units, which are kind of the predecessor. But the problem with those is each individual animal has their own bunk, and you don't get that same kind of herd competition and behavior that you get with a single mineral feeder. So I'm kind of excited to see what data we get using that approach and taking into account that herd behavior, because if you watch cows for very long, you'll know that there is a behavior aspect to how they consume feed and how they move throughout their environment. So excited to go down that line as well.
Yeah, I always think of Kentucky too as having, tends to have like high sulfur. And I don't know, is that as much of a problem now that some of the more like the coal emissions have kind of been tightened up? Because historically that was a little bit more associated with burning high sulfur coal, and that ends up in the environment. It ends up plants basically respire that, and then they're, breathe it in, right? And then they're accumulating sulfur in those plants. Is that still as much of a challenge in Kentucky?
I'd say we still have a sulfur issue, but we get a lot of sulfur. We have a lot of byproducts. So Iowa's kind of known as the byproduct state, but we have a lot too from our bourbon distilling industry. And there's some data out there that says that the distillers' products from the production of spirits or bourbon ethanol is different than that of fuel ethanol. I mean, usually it's a little less sulfur. But one of the unique feedstuffs that we have here that I wasn't familiar with in Iowa, we have a lot of these smaller craft distilleries. And so they are producing stillage or thin stillage. So it's, or slop is what it's also referred to. And it's about 93 to 95% water. And on a dry matter basis, it's very similar to dried distillers. But it is a extremely high moisture product. And the distilleries give it away for free. So it's a free feed stuff. The problem is it does have a lot of sulfur. It's also really high in copper, like 80 to 90 parts per million of copper in some of the samples I've seen. And we don't have a great idea of like how repeatable it is across distilleries and that kind of thing. It's an area that I have some interest in trying to understand a little bit more. But it's everywhere. It gets fed a lot. And if you calculate it out for a producer how much they're actually feeding on a dry basis, they would never feed that much dried distillers to their cows, but it's free and the cows like it, so they eat it and they feed it. And so that's another area that we have. We can get quite a bit of high sulfur in our diets. So yeah, that's still something that we struggle with. And I have seen multiple total diet analysis where sulfur is 0.5, 0.8%, which as a nutritionist makes me cringe a little bit and like, whoa, we got to make some adjustments here. So yeah, it's still an issue, but maybe, we think about it maybe a little differently. But yeah, it's absolutely still something that we deal with.
Yeah. And of course, on the high sulfur, when you think about like cow diets, as long as we're not talking about like confined cows, thinking more about cows that have access to lots of forage, they can definitely tolerate that 0.5% sulfur or whatever, because it's keeping the rumen pH from dropping too much. They're less likely to get true sulfur toxicity themselves, but probably their bigger concern is all of the negative effects on the trace minerals that sulfur loves to bind to in the rumen. So things like selenium, things like copper, things like zinc, things like manganese are all probably negatively affected in those cows. So yeah, you've got a trace mineral challenge there.
Yeah, and the other thing about this feed stuff is that as it comes from the distillery, it's like a pH of like 3.5 or 4. It's very acidic. And so we make the general recommendation that people should be adding bicarb to it to try to increase the pH of it a little bit. Don't know that always happens in the real world, but it's a very acidic feed stuff. And so that also makes me wonder about those rumen dynamics a little bit with it, because that's a large volume of a low pH entering the rumen when they consume that.
Absolutely. So are they consuming it like in a lick tank kind of thing?
Open troughs.
Okay. So they're straight up drinking it.
Yes. Yep. They straight up drink it. We do have some people that are using it in a TMR as a moisture ingredient in TMRs, and I like it there. And if we can limit feed it, it's a protein supplement with some fat. I mean, if we really get down to the nitty gritty of what it is, I think it can be a useful feed stuff. We just tend to feed a lot of it, and they consume a lot of it. And it's free. If I hadn't mentioned that before, it's free. So it's a challenge to get people to understand that just because it's free doesn't mean we need to use it. But at the same time, with where producers have been over the last couple of years with cattle prices and feed prices, it's a tough sell for me to tell you not to use a free feed stuff. So trying to do some work in that area and understand how we can help producers use that feed stuff in ways that aren't going to negatively impact them. Because like I said, it's a protein supplement. It can be and has some fat to provide some energy. So it can make sense if we use it within reason.
I think this is actually a really great example of why land grant institutions and the extension part of that mission are so critical to maintain at the state level, because I see more and more places that are kind of elbowing out extension for whatever reason. Everybody's suffering with tight budgets, but and even some discussion about having like regional specialists. So this state will have the sheep person, and this state will have this person. And I think that this is a great example of how important it is to serve our local, in this case, beef producers with extension expertise.
Yeah, and I'm really fortunate in Kentucky. So we have county extension agents in every single county, and most of them have an A&R, Ag and Natural Resources, 4-H, and Family and Consumer Science. Some have multiple agents in a given area. And then we've got a really great group of specialists in the college that support beef. So we have 5 specialists in animal science that are beef extension specialists. And then we've got, folks in ag econ and forages, ag engineering, that all do things related to beef. So we have a really strong network of people here. And that's one thing that I don't see everywhere. And so because of that, I've got a geneticist, an extension geneticist in my department, and an extension repro physiologist in my department. So when I get those questions, I can send them straight to the expert. And that's really nice to have that, because I know not everybody does. And who knows what it will look like in the future. 30 years from now, that might look really different, but right now we have it, and it's a really big strength, I think, to our program, and a big strength for our producers.
This is kind of a random question, but I remember when I was in grad school at North Carolina State, there had been a lot of basically part of the tobacco buyout where formerly farmers raising tobacco basically were incentivized to stop doing that and get into the beef industry. Mm-hmm. Has that been the case historically in Kentucky as well?
Yeah, so we had the big tobacco buyout and the tobacco settlement. And one of the things that Kentucky did, the state legislature back in the late 90s passed a bill that created the Kentucky Ag Development Board that oversees those ag development funds. And so those have been, and the idea here is that they created a pot of money that could be used to create a educational framework for those producers that were moving away from tobacco and diversifying their farms. And so we work with colleagues at the Kentucky Beef Network, which is kind of an arm of our Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, but the Beef Network is responsible for education programs. So we work with the Beef Network to deliver those programs as extension specialists, and are able to apply for grant funding through the Ag Development Board. So that has really funded a lot of our extension programs, has allowed us to maintain some more intensive in-person sessions. It allows us to do that at an extremely low cost or no cost to the producer. And so we're pretty fortunate in that. And then, a lot of our counties also have extension tax in their county. So every taxpayer in that county, whether they're agricultural or not, are paying into that, and that helps fund county offices and county level programs. So because of that, we have a extremely large network of nice offices. I never have to struggle to come up with a place to do a meeting. Those are great resources in those communities. And then we've got the people to support those offices and those programs as well. So, something that it could have definitely been devastating to a state that was so heavily involved in tobacco production has really allowed us to move things forward in a different direction, and certainly moved our beef industry forward. I know that just in my my dealings when I was in the Midwest. Kentucky cattle used to have a really negative stigma about them to the feedlot producer. They were high risk calves, and they were things that people didn't necessarily want, and we've been able to make a lot of forward momentum and maybe change that stigma a little bit over the years to where Kentucky cattle are something that feed yards want to feed and want to have, and that's for a state that's predominantly cow-calf. I don't think we could ask for anything more.
Nice. So I know outside of sort of the applied mineral and some of the other things we've talked about with your extension program, you've also done some work thinking more about like kind of the future, right? And thinking about wearable technologies and things like that. So tell us a little bit about what that's looked like in your program.
Yeah, so my work with primarily with cow manager tags, which are smart ear tags, actually started at Iowa State, and we were starting to dabble in those. And I feel like we had them on almost every animal. Whether or not we used the data was maybe we didn't use them as often. But one of my projects in your lab, of course, was you doing an LPS challenge, and it was I still use that graph of how striking a change it is. Of course, anybody that's used LPS as a challenge model knows it's a pretty potent punch, but those tags were able to pick up that difference, and you could just tell looking at the tag which animals got LPS and which animals got an injection of saline. But the fact that they're able to detect sick cattle remotely, is something that it'll continue to be refined, and that technology over time will continue to get better and more accurate, more precise. And as technology gets wider adoption, it tends to come down in price as well, and make it more affordable for producers. Right now, I can't necessarily sell our typical beef producer that's going to be an economic benefit for you. If you want it for your own peace of mind, your own information, that's a different story. But over time, we have like 60% of our producers have off-farm employment here. And so if I've got a wearable technology that's kind of keeping an eye on the cows for me while I'm not there, that eventually could maybe tell me that I've got a heifer that's about to calve or has been trying to calve and now needs some assistance, and I'm off farm, like to me that's a very valuable piece of technology. If it saves one heifer or saves one calf, especially when cattle prices are high, it all of a sudden it becomes a much more appealing to invest in that technology. But it's not there for every producer at this point, but it'll continue to get there. So we had a system here. The tornado took it out, and so we'll be replacing that as we get our building built back to have the infrastructure to set that system up. But yeah, we've had some of that technology. Also hoping to get into some work with some GPS collars and using that to track animals within a field, more or less to study animal behavior a little bit. But again, that it's all that same technology that eventually I could see it being something that producers use to keep an eye on the herd when they're not there. And so it is very futuristic. And as I tell producers, I teach a lecture in our senior level beef science class for the undergraduates about technology. And the true cattle kids they're always skeptical. And I'm like, don't think about now, don't think about practical, think about where we could be in 50 years. Because if my grandpa thought ever that we would have a smartphone that does all the things that smartphone does, he would have thought I was crazy. So thinking about where this technology might be at the end of my career is really fascinating, and it's only going to get there if we start to do work on it now. So yeah, it's another area that, again, it's not necessarily ready for every producer to adopt. We know that, especially in the beef industry, because it's so extensive. We can't just put a Wi-Fi system in the barn like we can in dairy and some of our other species. It's so extensive, and that's a challenge that we'll continue to overcome. But I've got colleagues in ag engineering that are doing a lot of work with drones and cattle, monitoring with drones and stuff. And so, that who knows where that technology will be. But like I said, we won't ever get to adoption if we don't do the work on the front end to get it there.
It makes me curious if you have jumped into the world of generative AI at all, or see any opportunities for either your role in extension or, opportunities for the beef industry.
That's a good question. I really haven't dived into that too much, but it's one of those things that we probably do need to have our eye on, because if we don't adopt it, it's going to adopt itself, and these tools, I think, will continue to grow, and finding ways that we can make them be a benefit to producers, down the road. Maybe that's something that we're interested in. I think about my typical extension user. I don't know if they're quite ready to adopt that kind of stuff, but it's all future, that in that realm of what I do, I'm really thinking about 30, 50 years down the line when I'm retired, hopefully.
Oh, I'll definitely be retired. But so I think sometimes about data collection is one of our biggest challenges in the beef industry, right? If we don't measure it, we can't manage it. So is, having a generative AI kind of driven app or something like that going to be something that could really help with the data collection side, right? And, even with pinging with reminders of 7272 was supposed to calve recently. Did you record her birth weight and, a calving score and, whatever else. And that's probably a bad example, but I just think of different ways that we could do a better job, because then we could find ourselves in a position to make stronger decisions, more strategic decisions for specific operations. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately should lead to, lesser overhead and maybe finding the right market for our specific animals to get premiums. And I just think there's a lot of benefit that could come from it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the examples I like to use, we talk a lot about body condition scoring for the cow herd, because that's an easy way to kind of assess her nutritional status without having to have a set of scales on the farm or anything like that. But if there was technology that could do that for us, and kind of take that opinion out of it and make it a little bit more objective, that would be something that I think could be super beneficial, because most of our producers do have technology, and especially here in where I'm at in Western Kentucky with so many of the grain farmers, like their tractors are way smarter than my car. So they've already adopted a lot of that technology on the grain side. We're kind of miles behind on the beef side if we start thinking about our level of technology adoption.
That's exactly the argument that I use here in Iowa, where so many of our feedlotters are actually farmer feeders, right? Like about 50% or 40% of our cattle in feedlots here, and feedlots under 1,000 head. And so they're there because they're a way to add value to the corn that farmer is already growing. So yeah, you're totally right. They're already adopting GPS controlled tractors, and they're sitting in there scrolling on their social media while the tractor drives itself. Just kidding, but that's totally what you picture. Maybe they are.
Well, and I mean, I know some that if that GPS goes down and they're planning, they stop, because it is so reliant. It is such a benefit to them to have that tool, and that's where we've got to get on the beef side. That I'm a firm believer that a lot of the technology that I dream about probably already exists in another industry or another sector. And it's just getting it applied to beef cattle, which I'm a ruminant nutritionist, not an engineer that does that, but that's where collaboration, I think, will really start to move us forward. Because sometimes it's about just finding that, knowing that that technology could have another home or could have another purpose, because it was developed for something totally different, but it could benefit beef production.
Absolutely.
It's time for our famous three.
Well, Katie, it's been really fun getting to catch up with you again, but I think we're coming to the end of our time together, so it's time for our famous three questions.
Okay.
All right, so question number 1, what is your favorite beef-related resource?
It is the NRC. When I need an easy answer, and I need a quick number, I go to the NRC. So many of our extension publications and such are based off the NRC. And we use those numbers that are published in that book a lot. So it's actually about 2 feet from me right now on my desk. So it's here quite often. And especially if I get, like, I had a question about water iron levels the other day. And I was like, I don't know much about that, but I'm going to go to the NRC and see what it tells me. Turns out nobody knows much about that related to beef production, but at least now I know that the NRC told me that too.
When I have a question about iron in water, I call Olivia Schroeder because she did that work with Dave Beatty during her master's, and I have her text. I can just text her and be like, "Yo, what do you know about this?"
I did read her paper when I was trying to find the answer to that question.
Oh, so funny. I thought for a second there you were just going to say the NRC and then be like, just like a mic drop, right?
Yeah, no, I'll defend it. And I tell my producers all the time that's what we use to set these requirements. These aren't just made up numbers. That there's a lot of research that goes into those, and even our mineral recommendations are based off of what's in the NRC. It's a big collection of work from a lot of scientists that comes together to make that resource.
Absolutely. Okay, question number 2. What's a resource not related to beef that you're enjoying?
I've been doing some reading on writing strategies, and how to be a more effective writer. When I came into this job, I had done quite a bit of academic writing, and now I do a lot of more popular press writing, and so my audience change, and I actually, I have to do both. My audience is constantly changing. So I'm trying to always look at resources to help me do both of those things better. Because it's a little different strategy for how I approach both those types of writing.
So I'll give you a pro tip. I actually think that this is a place where, and the one that I use is ChatGPT, the professional version. So it's GPT-4 as we're recording this in March of 2024. So there's probably some other versions too, like Poe.com has Claude, and I think they're up to Claude 3 and whatever the different programs are. But this is one of the things where I think it can be fabulous at helping you figure out if you've hit the right audience. So you can write something, and if it's just natural for you to write it from a really technical perspective, but then you want to take it to a different level, you can put that information in either as a file upload or in the prompt box and basically say, what are ways that you would help me suggest to rephrase things to hit, a more lay audience, and then you can define that. I've actually done that for some things like with proceedings papers, or had students work through some of that process. And you have to be careful with some things. You don't want to necessarily have it rewrite things because it might not bring your tone into it. But if you prompt it right, you can say, don't rewrite it. Just tell me the places where maybe I've hit jargon or something that somebody's not going to understand. Or the other thing is, it's really good, and I've used this in class, at doing it's like made up scenarios for things, basically. So yeah, I think it can be a really good tool for some of those things.
Yeah, I haven't used it, but I'll have to look into it.
Okay, third and final question. What is a trait of someone you know that has helped make them successful?
So I actually will, I'm going to use you as an example, actually, because for those of you that you don't necessarily know us as individuals, I think we're very different individuals in how we think about things and how we move about things. And I tend to get more bogged down in things, and that really, I need things to be perfect on the first draft, and and then they never end up being that way. But it delays my progress. And so, one of the things that I learned working with you is to start and to work through that process and break things up in chunks um, and start tackling the small pieces. And that's not something that I do naturally. Like my brain has a hard time with that sometimes. And so there's a lot of things that I learned working through your lab in grad school that I still use to get things accomplished, whether that's a grant application or a paper or an article I'm writing. Just being able to break things down in chunks and recognize that it doesn't have to be perfect on the first try is something that I took from my time in your lab that I still use.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And I definitely didn't pay her folks to say that.
Nope, she did not.
But as a recovering perfectionist myself, I can totally see that, right? It's so easy. So, it's, the enemy of perfection is done. That's what we used to talk about, right? And we have that conversation with all kinds of students from freshmen all the way up through late stage PhDs. And there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that's one bite at a time. So you got to get started.
Yep, and I mean, in my mind, I want to have it all planned out and have it flow perfectly, and it doesn't work that way. The papers that we publish, and regardless of what type you're publishing, a good paper is going to change, and it's going to mold, and you're going to take feedback and criticism from your colleagues or your co-authors, and ultimately it ends up being a better product than you could ever do just on your own. And that's something that I used to kind of struggle with, like reading criticism and feedback of my own writing. And now I seek it out and look for it, because you don't get as much of it as a faculty member as you did as a student. So when I can get some feedback on things, it's really helpful to make sure that I'm hitting the mark, because sometimes you think you're saying something and it's very clear and it's not. And ultimately you want whatever product you're publishing and putting out there to be clear and to hit the mark and get your message across.
Absolutely. Well, Katie, it's been really fun to catch up with you and see where you've kind of not really grown. You were grown when you left Iowa State a few years ago, but cool to see where you're going in your program, and having gone through so many challenges there with the tornado and coming into your program early in COVID. It's really cool to see where you're going and the excitement with, being kind of finding your perfect place there. So before we sign off, is there anything that, like in terms of socials or places where folks might follow you or connect with the things you're doing there at Kentucky Extension?
Yeah, we have our Facebook page, UK Beef Extension, University of Kentucky Beef Extension. That's where you'll find most of our latest programs that we're working on and publications that we're putting out. And that's kind of the home for most of our beef communication.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.